So George Washington and a lot of these earlier American so-called heroes would just wantonly genocide entire nations, entire towns, entire villages. 40 Iroquois towns were wiped away. Just a genocidal massacre. George Washington in 1779, the Sullivan expedition, and that's where he got the name Indian Town Destroyer. And it's just amazing, he killed all the villages, all men, women, and children, except for the women that his men wanted. So there's a rape culture, there's murder, and there's genocide. But I was thinking, an analogy. I have a roach problem here in my house, and I have to be. It was here before I got here, so it wasn't anything I did. But I have to be vigilant when they have such a short reproductive cycle that if one cockroach is let to go back to their nest, then there could be a whole 100 of them created. So the way they kill Native Americans is like how I kill cockroaches. Okay, and there was a comparison about lice. Lice makes nits at the great children Cherokee massacre of Yahoo Falls. So this comparison of being lice, of being cockroaches, that's how George Washington is treating the Amerindians. He's treating them like they're cockroaches, like they're less than human, like they're lice. Who gives a shit? Let's just murder all of them. Let's kill every one of them. So that way we can just take the land and do as we please with ourselves, having to not share the land, not to be integrationists, not to live peacefully next to each other as Jesus Christ himself would want us to do. In 1766, the great George Washington sent a rogue and runaway slave to the Caribbean islands to be sold for rum, molasses. There's lots of racism. I mean, he was a plantation owner. 1774, Washington said the new British laws would make Americans as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. So Washington is using race as saying, we're not like our own slaves. We don't want to be treated like the slaves. The British are treating us like the slaves, or they're treating us like the way we treat our slaves. And that's like supposed to be like, it's a exciting speech to get them whipped into a frenzy. When Washington crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Day, there's an Indian woman who was on the bow of his boat to guide him across. 1778-79, Washington was reluctant to buy or sell slaves, although he felt that if these poor wretches are to be held in a state of slavery, I do not see that a change of masters will render it more irksome, provided husband and wife and parents are not separated from each other, which is not my intention to do. Then 1779 Sullivan expedition, also known as the Sullivan-Clinton expedition, led by Major General John Sullivan and Brigadier General James Clinton, was an extended systematic military campaign against the four Amerindian nations of the Iroquois. It occurred mainly in the lands of the Iroquois Confederacy, today the heartland of New York State. The expedition occurred during the summer of 1779, beginning June 18th, when the Army marched from Easton, Pennsylvania, burning Iroquois crops, villages, and chattels with massive bonfires. With the Amerindian shelter gone and food supplies destroyed, thereafter the strength of the Iroquois Confederacy was broken. The death toll from exposure and starvation dwarfed the casualties received in the Battle of Newtown, in which about 1,000 Iroquois were decisively defeated by an army of 3,200 Continental soldiers. Caucasian loyalists also lost their homes and lands in the deliberate scorched earth actions explicitly ordered by George Washington, who was soon after known to Amerindian cultures by the pejorative the burner of towns. Sullivan's army then carried out a scorched earth campaign. Total warfare, just like William Tecumseh Sherman, terrorism, attacking civilians, methodically destroying at least 40 Iroquois villages. 40 Iroquois villages wiped out. Throughout the Finger Lakes region of western New York, the survivors fled to British regions in Canada and the Niagara Falls and Buffalo areas. Devastation created great hardships for the thousands of Iroquois refugees who fled the region to shelter under British military protection outside Fort Niagara that winter, and many starved or froze to death despite attempts by the overstressed resources of the British authorities to import food and provide shelter. The Sullivan expedition devastated the Iroquois crops and towns and left them dependent upon the mercy of the British for the harsh winter of 79 to 80. Major Jeremiah Fogg of the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment noted in his journal, "The nests are destroyed, but the birds are still on the wing." The expedition objective of ending the frontier war was, however, not realized as British and Indian attacks continued in the following years. 1786, Hanadaguyus, George Washington, right? Conotokarius, Hanadaguyus, complained about a Quaker abolitionist society. "I can only say that no man living wishes more sincerely than I do to see the abolition of slavery, but when the slaves who are happy and content remain with their present masters are tampered and seduced to leave, it introduces more evils than it can cure." George Washington, 1786, "is demonstratively clear that on this estate, Mount Vernon, I have more working Negroes by a full half than can be employed to any advantage in the farming system." So poor Washington, man, he's got too many slaves, man. Poor guy. Poor Conotokarius. Poor Hanadaguyus. He's got too many slaves. Before 1793, Washington said, "The unfortunate condition of the people whose labors I in part employed have been the only unavoidable subject of regret. To make the adults among them as easy and comfortable as their actual state of ignorance and improvidence would admit, and to lay a foundation to prepare the rising generation for a destiny different from that in which they were born, affording some satisfaction to my mind, and could not, I hoped, be displeasing to the justice of the Creator." 1793, as President, Hanadaguyus Washington signed the Fugitive Slave Act. George Washington signed the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act established that the white police officers were going to be running and chasing black men and women who ran away from their slavery to make sure they go back. So automatically, the police forces and black folks are opposing each other. 1799, Washington, Hanadaguyus, So Hanadaguyus, and Conotokarius complained that he had too many slaves. "To sell the overplus I cannot, plus I'm principled against this kind of traffic in the human species. To hire them out it's almost as bad, because they cannot be disposed of as in families to any advantage, and to disperse the families I have an aversion. What then is to be done? Something must, or I shall be ruined." Washington owned hundreds of black slaves. Black laborers were captured, shipped, sold, and resold in order to provide cheap labor for George Washington and Thomas Jeffersons of North America. George Hanadaguyus Conotokarius Washington, 3rd generation plantation owner, owning 317 slaves at the time of his death, believed the Amerindians to be inferior to Europeans. George Washington bought and sold Indian lands without tribes' permissions, fought and killed Indians without mercy. The revolt against Britain, while cast in the language of universal rights and freedoms, was also a blow against royal protection of Indian lands and against freedom for black folks. And the revolt was led by those such as Benjamin Franklin, Tom Jefferson, George Conotokarius Washington, Patrick Henry, with considerable financial stake in the acquisition of such lands. Ben Franklin, Tom Jefferson, Washington, Henry all made shit tons of money in the acquisition of Amerindian lands. The American Revolutionary War was just a white civil war dedicated to the proposition of stealing Amerindian land. British American colonials had been outraged by the proclamation of 1763, properly seen as a royal restriction on their right to settle, seize, purchase, otherwise acquire Westline Indian lands, and in 1776 they rebelled against the crown in order to steal those lands. After the rebellion, Washington became president and waged war on Indians in the land now called Ohio. After a disastrous loss of an army under General St. Clair in 1791, Washington sent a new army in 1794 under General Mad Anthony Wayne, the psychopath of psychopaths. They called him Mad Anthony Wayne. And he was fucking crazy, bloody, genocidal, rape culture, piece of shit. Mad Anthony Wayne won the war at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which eventually gives all of Ohio to Washington. The Canandaigua Treaty, 1794, that soon followed, put the American government, not the states, in charge of Indian affairs. American government was to uphold their rights, approve all land transactions, deal with Indian nations as independent governments. In practice, though, it pretty much turned into a blind eye to whatever the states did, like allowing whites to steal Amerindian land. It was not till the 1970s that Amerindian nations had a way to contest land claims. When George Conotokarius Washington, Conotokarius, Hanadaguyus, we'll work on that later. When George Conotokarius Washington died at his inherited Mount Vernon in 1799, he owned 317 slaves. Most blacks and Native Americans fought against Conotokarius George Washington and Hanadaguyus. Most blacks and Native Americans fought against George Washington and the other English colonists during the American Revolutionary War of Independence. Should be big red flags. The Black Hills are hallowed ground of the Sioux, and Mount Rushmore was a sacred mountain in the Black Hills, the hallowed ground of the Sioux. It was a sacred mountain before the sculptor Gutzon Borglum desecrated with 4 white men's faces, one of them being Conotokarius, the town destroyer, George Washington himself, a third-generation plantation owner, signer of the Fugitive Slave Act, an Indian genocider, and leader of one of the 2 factions of the White Civil War for Amerindian land. Mohawk Mingo War Chief Plucky-me-no-tea, Tecanyaterighto, was buried by members of his tribe on a bluff overhanging the nearby Royal Springs next to McClellan Station, modern-day Georgetown. And for a number of years afterwards, a popular legend claimed that the echo heard in the area was the death cry of the Mohawk Mingo War Chief Plucky. So, if you hear an echo, that's the death cry of Chief Plucky if you're in Georgetown. Hanadaguyus, that's George Washington's name. They changed all the Indians' names to their names, so we're going to switch it back. So George Hanadaguyus would scare the shit out of Native Amerindians. Hanadaguyus is coming. Here comes Hanadaguyus, or Conotokarius. Hanadaguyus, Conotokarius, here he comes. And Washington, he liked that name. He would sign Conotokarius in some of his personal letters because, I'm a fucking Indian killer. I'm a fucking shitty genocidal bastard. That's George Washington. So, Chief Plucky's legacy continues on because Chief Plucky had a baby Plucky. There was Plucky 2, Tecanyaterighto 2. Plucky-me-no-tea 2, baby Plucky. So baby Plucky would continue fighting with the Delaware in several Amerindian raids upon the colonists. So the legacy of Plucky, while his raid seems like it was a suicidal mission, it seemed suicidal, but he was able to do a lot of damage before he succumbed to life's final nail in the coffin. He had accomplished a lot of things with his war tactics, but essentially September 1776 in December, he has a Christmas Day raid, does a lot of damage, dies, and we don't hear much about him. He established Plucky's town. Patrick Henry wanted to attack Plucky's town, but he was afraid for a general Amerindian war would break out. He didn't want to cross the Delaware in order to get to them, but that's the mentality. He wanted to wipe out Plucky's town, Mingo Village. They all was killing Mingo villages when Johnny Logan was returning their gunfire back to them. Another major difference is that the Native Americans, they didn't fight the way the European colonists did. European colonists were savage. They were savage white men. You want to talk about the Amerindians being savage? There's none more savage than the white people. The European colonists were some of the most vicious and savage people out there. They had no limits to the damage that they would do. They would burn entire villages. They kill them like lice. They kill them like they were cockroaches, like they weren't even people. That's what the European colonists were doing. And there's a rape culture, there's pedophilia, there's bloody massacres. So just stained with blood. American history, American Revolution is just stained with so much blood on so many innocent people. So many crimes are happening to so many innocent people. It's hard to enjoy in the Jubilee. So one of the major differences between Native Americans and the European colonists was Johnny Logan, his entire family is killed. 12 people. In retaliation, he kills 13. 1 for 1. That's the way he felt. His family was killed, so he killed their people. And the way the Virginia colonists, their reaction was to wipe out 7 Mingo villages, to just burn Chillicothe down, go on the Little Miami River, the Iroquois Nation, genocide, all over.